The chamber was tense, every eye fixed on the moment that was about to unfold. A man with decades of legal prestige believed he could bend the narrative, outwit, and silence a rising voice. But what he didn't expect was the sharpness, courage, and raw truth that would come crashing back at him. In an instant, the exchange lit up millions of screens, leaving one legacy in question and another forever cemented. What began as a calculated attempt to undermine turned into a viral moment that exposed much deeper truths about power, race, and resilience. Alan Dershowitz was no stranger to controversy. A legal scholar with a long history of defending high-profile figures, his confidence was legendary. He had spent decades shaping arguments that influenced courts, politicians, and media headlines. To many, he embodied the sharp edge of American legal intellect. But that same reputation often came with arrogance and the belief that no one could truly stand against him. On the other side stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a woman shaped by experience, resilience, and the weight of representing communities that had long endured injustice. For her, every moment in front of the microphone wasn't about spotlight or reputation, but about defending the truth of those who had been silenced for generations. She carried the scars of systemic inequity, not only from history books, but from the lived reality of her community. The stage was set in a public forum where words carried power and reputations could rise or fall in seconds. Dershowitz entered ready to dismiss, distort, and dominate, certain that his decades of rhetoric would be enough to crush opposition. But what unfolded would not only flip the narrative, but also shatter assumptions about who truly holds the microphone. In today's America, the opening words from Dershowitz dripped with condescension. He framed his arguments as if teaching a classroom, his tone heavy with the authority of age and experience. To his supporters, this was familiar, the way he controlled debates, cornering opponents with technicalities and a commanding presence. But something was different this time. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Instead of shrinking, she leaned into the weight of his words, listening not with intimidation, but with the quiet fire of someone who had weathered storms far more brutal than intellectual sparring. As Dershowitz pressed on, dismissing her perspectives and questioning her credibility, the audience sensed the imbalance. Here was a man who had built a career defending privilege, facing a woman who carried the voice of marginalized communities. It wasn't just an argument about law, it was a confrontation between two Americas. One that had historically dictated power and another demanding recognition. The tension rose with every sentence. Social media users clipped moments in real time, their captions boiling with outrage. Why does he think he can speak over her? And this is exactly what we've been fighting against. Jasmine, however, bided her time. She let him believe he was in control, absorbing the layered disrespect, the subtle digs about experience, the loaded undertones that so many women, especially black women in power, know all too well. When she finally moved to respond, the room shifted. Her words weren't rushed. They came like thunder after a long silence, deliberate and piercing. She spoke not only for herself, but for generations of voices dismissed, doubted, and disregarded. With each sentence, the imbalance flipped. The intellectual weight was no longer his to wield. In that moment, Crockett unleashed what would later be called one of the most powerful clapbacks ever caught on camera. She dismantled his claims piece by piece, exposing the cracks in his logic, highlighting the hypocrisy of his posturing, and calling out the arrogance that had too long gone unchecked. The impact was immediate. Dershowitz, a man accustomed to having the final word, sat visibly rattled. The audience erupted, not in laughter, not in mockery, but in recognition. They witnessed a shift. The old guard of privilege confronted by a fearless truth-teller who refused to be minimized. Cameras zoomed in as Dershowitz struggled to reassert control, but it was too late. Crockett's words had already ricocheted far beyond the chamber. Within minutes, hashtags lit up, clips went viral, and headlines declared the exchange a defining moment. This wasn't just about humiliation. It was about exposure. The world saw in raw clarity the dynamic that had played out quietly for centuries, the powerful attempting to silence the marginalized, only to be undone by the strength of resilience and truth. By the time the dust settled, the story was no longer about Dershowitz's attempt to dominate a debate. It was about the power of a clapback that represented so much more than a verbal exchange. Jasmine Crockett had given voice to a collective frustration, the sense that those who had for too long dictated the narrative were finally being held accountable. Her words didn't just humiliate a legal giant, they reignited conversations about race, power, and justice in America. Millions watched not just for entertainment, but for validation. Validation that the old ways of silencing women of color in public life were no longer going unchallenged. 4. Dershowitz, the humiliation lingered, a reminder that arrogance and authority can collapse in a single moment. For Crockett, it was more than a viral triumph. It was a continuation of her mission to remind the world that strength doesn't come from title or tenure, but from the courage to speak truth to power. The clip remains etched into the digital memory of the internet, not because it was entertaining, but because it revealed something undeniable. The fight for justice isn't confined to courtrooms or chambers. It happens in every exchange where someone dares to push back against erasure and disrespect. And so the question remains, how many more powerful figures will underestimate voices like Jasmine Crockett's before they realize the tide has already turned?